Hello, I'm Barry Pavel, the Senior Vice President at the Atlantic Council and Director of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security here, and I would like to welcome all of you to the Atlantic Council and another installment of our Future Foreign Policy series, convened by the Scowcroft Center's New American Engagement Initiative. We are really pleased to welcome my former colleague and author, Ben Rhodes. Thank you, Ben, for joining us today. At the Scowcroft Center, we work to develop sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and our allies and partners. The center honors the legacy of service of General Brent Scowcroft and embodies his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership in cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. Our New American Engagement Initiative assesses prevailing assumptions guiding U.S. foreign policy and offers up alternative approaches that utilize a wide range of elements of American power, including diplomacy, trade, information, and a wide range of other policy instruments. Today, we're really honored to host Ben Rhodes, former Deputy National Security Advisor to President Barack Obama. Ben has been at the center of some of the most consequential foreign policy decisions of the past decades, from the Iran nuclear deal to the reestablishment of diplomatic relations with Cuba, and his experience is invaluable for understanding the challenges and opportunities now facing the Biden administration. And I would also add that he knows national security strategy. He also had quite a hand in that in the Obama administration, and here at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, that's an effort that we think is particularly noteworthy. Ben's new book, After the Fall, Being American in the World We've Made, examines the global system that the United States has played such a significant role in shaping, with both its many benefits and its flaws, the challenges to democracy, the changing relationships between the United States and its allies, the era of great power competition, the linkage between the domestic environment and foreign policy. These are all areas worthy of exploration and in which most of which Ben explores in his book. These are also areas that our New American Engagement Initiative works to address frontally. Understanding these trends and their effects is really what the Future Foreign Policy series aims to do. Joining us today for our discussion with Ben, we are really thrilled to have Suzanne Kyanpour of the BBC. We're very happy to have Suzanne here for this conversation, both because of her journalistic talent and because she is an Atlantic Council alumnus, having previously been a senior fellow with our Digital Forensics Research Lab. Suzanne covered both the Iran nuclear deal and the détente with Cuba, making her the perfect person to speak with Ben on lessons for the future of U.S. foreign policy. Thank you all for joining us for this event. Please follow the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag #FutureForeignPolicy. If you have questions you would like to ask Ben, please submit them using the Q&A function on Zoom. And with that, over to you, Suzanne. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. It's great to be back. Great to speak to Ben again. And thank you for speaking with us today, Ben. So I wanted to start by asking you about your new book, After the Fall, Being American in the World We've Made. So I recently hosted a BBC documentary called America's Place in the World, and I wanted to know what you think. Where do you think America's place in the world is today? And more specifically, how has that changed since your time in Obama and the Obama administration?
Well, and first of all, thanks to the Atlantic Council, and thank you, Suzanne, for doing this conversation. One of the things I look at in the book is kind of this period of time from the end of the Cold War till basically today. A 30-year period where the United States really was in a pretty unique position in the history of international relations as the sole superpower, the country that had far and away more influence than anybody else. And, I think that was, as I say in the book, always something of an artificial moment in time. I think it's not a normal state of affairs for one country to have that much influence. For a host of reasons, I think by the time I came into the White House working for Barack Obama in 2009, that wave had already crested to some extent. We had the kind of double body blows of the Iraq War and the 2008 financial crisis. And the financial crisis is something I really wrestle with in this book a lot, in that both the Iraq War and the financial crisis had kind of undermined the extent to which America was deferred to as the country that could kind of set the pace and tone for global affairs. And so you already had a sense in the Obama years of the United States recalibrating its foreign policy and its place in the world to account for the fact that there was a rising China, there was pushback from Russia, there was a greater allocation of power and influence around the world than in the previous couple of decades. I think that what then happened is the Trump presidency kind of turbocharged that trend in the sense that not only was there questions about American policy, but there were questions about the fundamental of health and stability of American democracy itself. And America itself under Trump really had to turn inward to kind of deal with its own dysfunction. And so we're now at this interesting moment where we're clearly moving into a new era, a new dynamic of international relations. And, you know, the United States has to figure out what it means to be a country that is still the most influential country in the world, but no longer in any way, shape, or form a dominant power in the world. And I think that's a very complicated transition, made even more complicated by the fact that those questions about the health and stability of our democracy clearly aren't resolved just with one election in 2020. They continue to shadow basically everything that we're doing in the world and at home in ways that we're living through every day.
So in the book, you discuss how the decision to invade Iraq sent a consequential message to the world that the strong could do as they want to at the expense of the weak. So with this growing consensus that the US should avoid new military engagements, do you think that the threat of making similar mistakes is high? But also, as we're having this discussion, US involvement in Afghanistan is coming to an end after 20 years. But at the same time, the Taliban is taking large swaths of land. So do you think President Biden should send troops back in if Kabul were to come under threat?
I think, you know, what's interesting about the situation in Afghanistan as it fits into kind of the broader apparatus of the war on terror is that one of the things I wrestle with in the book is the extent to which I think we almost underappreciate how much terrorism and the war on terrorism and all of its component parts have come to dominate US national security policy. And, you know, I reflect on the experience of kind of coming into government in 2009, working for a president who wanted to kind of unwind those wars, deprioritize terrorism in the Middle East relative to issues like climate change and China, and the emerging health threats. We dealt with Ebola in the second term. Really not unlike what you hear from the Biden administration in terms of their desire to kind of reprioritize democracy, China, climate as the organizing principles of American foreign policy. The challenge was that the machinery of the United States government, the structure of agencies, the staffing of agencies, the budget and the resourcing of national security policy, never mind the ongoing military engagements in Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, Somalia, then we had Libya, other parts of the Horn of Africa. This kind of massive momentum behind counterterrorism made it quite difficult to, as we talked about, pivot to Asia or to kind of prioritize climate as the true existential threat to the future of American national security. That apparatus, despite the fact that Obama removed, you know, a significant, you know, from 150,000 troops in Iraq and Afghanistan down to 15,000, that's still what the U.S. government was built to do more than anything else in national security and foreign policy, to prosecute this war on terrorism. That the more time goes by, the more that seems like it's not something that should be the top priority. And I tell this story in the book about teaching a class at UCLA where I asked these young people to kind of rank what they thought the threats were, or the biggest challenges were for the country, and climate change, racial injustice, inequality, technology, a whole host of issues filled the blackboard, and no person mentioned terrorism. And I had given them to read George Bush's speech after 9/11 to Congress, and they read it like it was from another planet, right? So what does that mean for Afghanistan? I think it means, look, I think Biden made the conclusion that after 20 years, we kind of exhausted what was achievable in Afghanistan through a continued military presence. And that sustaining a 2,500 or 5,000 US troop presence in the coming years was not going to arrest the deterioration that was ongoing in Afghanistan. In some ways, not only was it taking up the resources and bandwidth of the United States government, but it was kind of this impediment to Afghans being able to pursue diplomacy amongst themselves, absent kind of the United States presence. Look, watching this is quite painful, and clearly there are going to be some very difficult days ahead in Afghanistan, none of which we want to see. I mention the broader context, though, because I think that while leaving Afghanistan at some point, whether you agree that that should be done, right now, whether that was going to be in a few months, whether you would have tried to give it another year or two to pursue additional diplomacy, I would argue that that's actually not even the broader structural issue of the degree to which US national security apparatus is built to wage the war on terrorism, the resources, authorities, and bandwidth of the US government is still overweighted to deal with terrorism in the Middle East. So to me, just ending the war in Afghanistan and keeping in place the rest of the post 9/11 enterprise actually wouldn't even achieve the end that I think Biden himself would like to achieve, which is to reduce the prioritization on terrorism. It's going to require a whole set of choices across the Middle East and across US budgeting and national security policy that truly kind of build the machinery of the US national security apparatus to deal with these issues of democracy, climate change, China, that I think they rightly say they want to focus on. At the same time that, obviously you're going to have to continue to be engaged as best you can diplomatically through security assistance, through humanitarian assistance in a place like Afghanistan, where we're dealing with, the wake of 40 years of American presence and in some cases, American mistakes.
So those are long-term goals, but in the short term, let's say that it does get as bad as some fear it might. Should President Biden send troops back in if Kabul comes under threat?
I mean, I think that they have to determine. I mean, clearly they would send troops back in if they felt like there was, a safe haven for a terrorist organization that threaten the United States. In terms of the survivability of the Kabul government, I think there's a conversation that they have to have with the Afghan government, the Afghan National Security Forces, about under what circumstances and with what kind of military force might the United States become engaged? Because there's a question of whether you send in US troops, whether you deploy US air power again for the protection of Kabul. I think that before they make that decision, they'll want to determine whether or not the Afghan security forces can at least hold some territory, including around Kabul. I do think that the issue of redeploying US ground forces, I think that's a pretty in extremis type of question. I think whether or not US air power could be brought to bear to provide some additional support to the Afghan National Security Forces, that's the kind of thing that I would imagine they're going to be more open to. But it's a complicated endeavor because you want your first priority is to see that hopefully the Afghan security forces can get enough support from the United States to be able to hold a certain amount of territory, not so that you're fixing everything in Afghanistan, but so that creates some opening for there to be continued diplomacy between the Afghans. I say this recognizing how difficult this is and how unlikely an improvement in the situation is in the near-term future. But I do think you want to be cautious about the kind of redeployment of U.S. ground forces once you've made the decision that President Biden has made.
What were some of the mistakes that were made during the Obama years that you think can be fixed now? What would you do differently if you were back in the White House?
Well, I mean, I think to me the irony of of that question, and which I get a fair amount, um, is, and I'm maybe Suzanne, I'm probably betraying what my position was in internal debates at the time. So I recognize this as kind of one person's view. But to me, the irony is that often the restraint of the Obama administration is what came in for criticism in Washington. You know, we were not sufficiently committed to the mission in Afghanistan, or we allowed relationships with traditional U.S. partners in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and Israel, to suffer in the pursuit of an Iran nuclear agreement. When I look back on the mistakes, they actually tend to be, in my view, more areas where we didn't show enough restraint, right? So I think that the surge in Afghanistan in 2009, when you look at that kind of massive allocation of resources, and then you look at the results, I'm not sure that holds up well. You know, we were able to do what was necessary to degrade Al Qaeda, to take out Osama bin Laden. I think that could have been done without those 30,000 additional troops, which didn't significantly improve the situation in Afghanistan. In some cases, created dependencies, did not fix issues like corruption, but actually some of those issues got worse. I look at obviously something like the Saudi-led war in Yemen that the United States supported, provided logistical support, tentatively, of course, but at the same time, you can't look at that and think that that was anything other than a mistake. And when you look at both the strategic circumstances in the region and above all, the humanitarian costs in a place like Yemen. So it's interesting to me when I look back at some of these areas where at the time the pressure was to kind of do more. Actually, I think we did too much. And it hampered the capacity to kind of truly execute this pivot to deal with a broader agenda, which I think we were doing. If you look at the second term, the Paris Climate Agreement, the Iran Nuclear Accord, the opening Cuba, those were the outlines of a kind of post 9/11 period foreign policy. Obviously, Trump then scrapped a lot of that stuff, right? Which is somewhat beyond our control. But to me, like interestingly, the mistakes tended to be mistakes of action. Even if you look at obviously Syria, which comes up and should, you know, there's the question of whether the initial call for Assad to go and decision to support an opposition that was inherently in an asymmetrical conflict because of the amount of support that Assad was going to get and was getting already from Russia and Iran, that raised expectations that we were not able to meet because we were not going to go into another war in the Middle East. So in a lot of areas, I think some of the lessons I draw are to be wary of overextension or of getting kind of half involved in something at a time when your strategic objective is to unwind the post 9/11 enterprise, because you're looking at a world in which over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, clearly the survivability of democracy, the need to deal with climate change, the need to develop multilateral approaches to manage very disruptive technologies, those things are going to have a much greater impact on the lives of the American people than our capacity to try to engineer events inside of a set of Middle Eastern countries. That suggests to me that you know that you sometimes need to you need to take on risk in terms of what you're not willing to do in order to do the things that America has to do going forward.
So speaking of taking on risk and kind of looking forward, during President Biden's recent trip to Europe, much of the discussion with allies revolved around countering China. Can you define what the US relationship with China actually is and what it should be?
So I deal with this a lot in the book, and I really kind of reckon with the extent to which there is an enormous amount of momentum behind a Chinese model that blends together capitalism, technology, hyper focus on national security and nationalism under a really pretty totalitarian umbrella. And I kind of inhabit the experience of the Hong Kong protest movement as kind of a test case of this model encroaching. And clearly it's rippling out through the Belt Road Initiative and other more assertive policies of China. And where the relationship has evolved to is it's an incredibly competitive one and at times confrontational one. And I think in the Obama years, we were at the tail end of a period where, I often thought of the US-China relationship like a scale. You had the things where we had serious disagreements and there were always trade irritants, and obviously there are human rights issues and tensions, geopolitical tensions in areas like the South China Sea. But, you're working together with China to stabilize the global economy after the financial crisis. We obviously worked together with China to build basically the infrastructure that became the Paris Agreement to deal with climate change. And the kind of cooperation and competition elements of the relationship, there's a balance to them. Well, right now, everything is on the other side of that equation. It's morphed into a competitive relationship. I think what the Biden team is currently trying to do is, whereas Trump had pivoted to a kind of bilateral confrontation focused on a very particular set of issues, chiefly trade issues, the Biden team is seeking to both broaden, frankly, the areas where we have concerns with China, to have a greater focus on human rights, to have a significant focus on technology and security of supply chains and cyber issues and trade issues. And the Biden team is trying to multilateralize that competition. So the challenge, obviously, to multilateralizing things is you have to agree with your allies. And I think that there's a lot of work to be done for the United States and Europe and other like-minded countries in Asia and around the world to develop common views of these issues. But I do think that in any event, we're clearly entering into a period where, for the foreseeable future, there's going to be both a competition of political models and a geopolitical competition for influence or for how we shape, how new technologies are used and how supply chains are secured. I think that inevitably that's necessary, and that's not just a choice of the United States government. I think China has made a concerted decision, particularly under Xi Jinping, to be a more assertive power that was inevitably going to create tension. I don't think we should repeat what I think was a mistake of the post 9/11 era, where we built kind of an entire enterprise to oppose something. I think that the way to deal with this over time is to focus more affirmatively on, okay, what are we for? What is our political model, by the way, which is in question. I don't think you can go into a clash of political models and ideologies when American democracy itself is so dysfunctional and so contested at home, right? I think that we need our own solutions to how are we going to deal with the disruptive nature of technologies, not just designed in opposition to China, but I don't think we've thought through how are we regulating social media and the development of artificial intelligence. So kind of across the board, we're entering into this competitive period with China. I would like us to see a focus above all on kind of getting our own house in order. And by the way, that extends it kind of across the democratic world, where I think you see a need to kind of revitalize what liberal democracy means today. The more we get that foundation right, I think that the healthier and better our approaches will be when we inevitably are in competition with China.
So you were significantly involved in the Iran nuclear deal, and Iran has chosen China as its main strategic ally against the US. Right now, the clock is kind of ticking. The window seems to be closing for a deal to be reached between the US and Iran to kind of re-enter the JCPOA, or to have a different deal. I mean, what do you foresee kind of happening when it comes to the Iran nuclear deal, especially as a new hardline president has just been elected? Could the JCPOA have stopped a hardliner from getting elected, a hardliner like Raisi?
I mean, Suzanne, like one of the things that's so frustrating about this is that when Trump made the determination to pull out of the JCPOA, not, I think, deeply informed by the individual provisions. My hope whenever I saw Trump railing against the JCPOA, I always wish that someone would just ask him, could you describe what the JCPOA is? But put that aside. It was so predictable, that look, I mean, how many of us said, like, if you pull out of this agreement, Iran is going to resume their nuclear program and begin, marching in the direction of accumulating enough material for a weapon. And it's going to embolden the harder line elements in the Iranian political system that were opposed to the JCPOA to begin with, and they're going to be less likely to make concessions on their nuclear program, never mind things like ballistic missiles and regional foreign policy. So yes, I think pulling out of the JCPOA contributed to this kind of particularly hardline movement in Iranian politics. I don't know that that completely precludes the capacity to get back to a JCPOA. I think that the Biden team, above all, they don't want the same two things that we didn't want in the Obama years. And this is a lot of same people, a lot of friends of mine. You don't want Iran to get a nuclear weapon, and you don't want to have another war in the Middle East. And so I think they're going to be looking for formulas to avoid those two outcomes. I continue to believe that the JCPOA is the best way to do that, the best foundation for future efforts to engage in diplomacy in Iran. I think absent that, there's also the precedent of the JPOA, the Joint Plan of Action, which was the interim agreement that preceded the JCPOA, reached in 2013. There may be some effort to kind of create some interim step that allows for a freeze of certain Iranian nuclear activities, so they're at least not moving in the wrong direction, even if they're not rolling back in the way they were in the JCPOA, for less sanctions relief than the more complicated sanctions relief that would be necessary to get to the JCPOA, given how much Trump dumped additional sanctions on Iran towards the end of his presidency. So I think you might see efforts to try to find an interim formula that at least averts those two outcomes. What the U.S. doesn't want, we don't want a war, we don't want Iran to get a nuclear weapon. Absent that, then I think we're back into the kind of dangerous territory that we were in the post-Trump decision in the Trump years.
And what about not addressing the Iranians' nefarious activities in the region? I mean, what's in it for the U.S. if that's not addressed this time around?
I mean, what's in it for the United States is Iran not having a nuclear weapon. And look, I would like Iran to not engage in nefarious activities across the region, but they weren't going to agree to that. And so the question was, do you try to address the most significant security threat emanating from Iran, which is them getting a nuclear weapon? Imagine all the nefarious things they're doing backed by a nuclear umbrella. That's much worse, right? And so I always, recoiled at these arguments that essentially the absence of addressing everything with Iran. Who wouldn't want to deal? Yes, of course we'd want to deal in which Iran gave up its nuclear program, gave up its ballistic missile program, and gave up its foreign policy. But that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen in the next 3 years. There's no way that's going to happen. And so the question is, can we at least roll back the nuclear program, verify that, maybe engage in some tough negotiations to try to extend some of those nuclear provisions, maybe try, and I think it'd be incredibly difficult, to bring in the ballistic missile program. Obviously, you have a set of other policies that are meant to deal with other things that Iran is doing in the region, but the kind of maximalist insistence on a deal that is never going to happen, to me, has been incredibly counterproductive to American foreign policy over the last decade. Because just sitting in Congress or on op-ed pages and saying Iran must agree to all these things is all well and good, but that's not how the world works. The world is about what is achievable here. And I think the JCPOA was about as much as you could achieve, and it was a lot. It didn't just stop the program, it rolled it back. And why wouldn't you want that in place? Why wouldn't you at least want to have the assurance that Iran could not develop a nuclear weapon and that you had a verification regime for that? I think we've gotten wrapped around the axle here. And the reality of this too is that I think we're going to look back on this period of time and wonder why we have a rising China, we've got a revanchist Russia, we've got climate change. The amount of time and bandwidth that Washington has put into like a medium-sized country in the Middle East relative to China and climate change and even Russia to some extent is going to be kind of baffling, I think, to future generations.
So the two feathers in your cap, the Cuba detente and the Iran nuclear deal, fell apart once Trump came into office. And now we just obviously have discussion about Iran. And now we're seeing in Cuba protests erupting. And basically the achievements that you made arguably were made possible because you kind of turn the other cheek with Iran and Cuba and the activities that, were nefarious. Is that something that Biden is going to have to do in order to reach a deal with Iran, or in order to, do something about Cuba? Is he going to have to follow in the Obama footsteps, or does he have to do something different?
So I don't agree with the premise, and I'm not saying it's your premise necessarily, Stan, but on Cuba, we negotiated through the normalization the release of 53 political prisoners. We negotiated through normalization an agreement from the Cuban government that they would expand internet access in the country, that they would expand Wi-Fi in the country, that they would allow for, and I helped engineer negotiations with technology platforms like Google to get into to Cuba. These were much greater advances, albeit incremental, for human rights than anything that's been achieved by just maintaining an embargo and issuing really tough statements from Washington. I mean, so we didn't. The purpose of the engagement was to help the Cuban people, was to improve their lives. The travel and other activity that we licensed within the context of the embargo, because we couldn't lift it without Congress, that helped pump a lot of blood into the Cuban private sector. There was a nascent Cuban private sector of people who owned small shops and drove cars and taxis and basically were connected to this tourism industry, or people who took remittances that are no longer allowed from the United States. This is money that went directly to the Cuban people, not to the Cuban government. Remittances aren't sent to the Cuban government, they're sent to the Cuban people. We had Americans traveling down there, staying in Cuban homes through Airbnbs and other arrangements. That was a direct exchange of ideas between Americans and Cubans that hadn't happened before. That too was resources going directly to the Cuban people. So I completely reject this idea that the only way to support the Cuban people is to punish them with an embargo that has them living in some of the most extreme poverty in the world, 90 miles from Florida. And 60 years of an embargo has done nothing to dislodge the Cuban Communist Party. If anything, the embargo has been the biggest gift possible to the Cuban Communist Party, because it allows them to have much greater control over society that is completely cut off from the world. So I just think that on Cuba in particular, I mean, Iran was we're dealing with a very particular security interest of the nuclear program. With Cuba, there's a complete insanity to the idea that an embargo and some strong rhetoric from Washington is going to achieve this year what it hasn't achieved in the last 60 years. There's also, I think we should be, you look at the vote in the UN on the embargo, when every single country in the world disagrees with what you're doing, except it was just the United States and Israel on the other side of that vote, you might want to consider why that is. And so to me, there are not policy options unless we are going to militarily intervene in Cuba. There's no sanction that has not been put on Cuba. This is the most sanctioned country in the world. There are no policy options to change the status quo other than finding different ways to engage. And by engaging, it doesn't just mean the Cuban Communist Party. What we were trying to do is engage the Cuban people, the private sector, the art sector, the people down there who ultimately are the kinds of people that were protesting. So I hope that the Biden team takes that step. I think politically, obviously, it's complicated in the United States because of the importance of Florida to American politics, and that's been that's obviously been in the backdrop of American-Cuban policy, certainly since the end of the Cold War.
I took 3 reporting trips to Cuba. So I went down on January 2015 for the first, when the opening happened. And then I went with President Obama in 2016. So first trip, I realized I have an internet addiction because I kept refreshing my phone, except I couldn't check my email. I wasn't getting email. My phone didn't work. But by the time I made it to cover Fidel Castro's funeral in November of 2016, I was standing in the square and I was like paying my bills on my banking app. So it was a pretty amazing transformation, at least when it comes to internet access at the time. So we are going to turn it over for Q&A from the audience. And thank you so much for putting up with my questions, Ben. Again, it's been a while.
Thanks, Suzanne.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. So my name is Christopher Preble. I'm the co-director of the New American Engagement Initiative here at the Scowcroft Center at the Atlantic Council. And again, thanks to Suzanne for that portion of the event, and thanks to Ben for joining us. We've got some excellent questions here in the Q&A. As a follow-on to the question on Cuba, we had a question from Laura Gill on the U.S. role in Latin America. In addition to Cuba, we could talk about Venezuela or Colombia, or most recently Haiti. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on that, Ben, just to sort of to draw the discussion around Cuba to a close as well.
Well, I think to connect those, and look, the Venezuela policy, there was this, in a way, it's a cautionary tale about what's happening in Cuba now, in the sense that when there were these protests in Venezuela, and when you had the opposition under Juan Guaido kind of stand up to Maduro, there was this kind of euphoria in Washington and rush to recognize Guaido, which I understand. Maduro is a bad guy. He's an authoritarian actor. We would like to see democracy in Venezuela. But look at where we are today. The assumption that somehow you're going to dislodge these governments through sanctions and what you say, particularly when they're on lifelines from Russia and China, I think is dangerously misguided. And if you look at what's happening in Latin America now, you see a pretty consistent pendulum swinging to the left. And the election in Argentina, in the election in Peru, in the protest in Colombia, in Lula's release from prison, and political comeback in Brazil, all of those dynamics are going to be harder to manage in the hemisphere if the United States remains back in this kind of pre-Obama detente Cold War with the Cubans. Our experience was, when we at least had a diplomatic opening to Cuba, well, we negotiated. We had an envoy, Bernie Aronson, in Havana negotiating the end of the Colombian Civil War. It opens up space for conversations in Latin America if you're not in this kind of conflict posture with Cuba, and so I do think that you're looking at a circumstance where, if the United States is playing a kind of traditional role of being kind of seeing its role as being an opposition to the Latin American left across the board, that's opening up a lot of space for China in Latin America, and that's like denying us a lot of opportunity to try to build multilateral initiatives around, say, something like a Haiti, where the best thing that we could be doing in Haiti right now is listening to Haitian civil society about what can we do differently than past aid efforts that have failed, but then trying to multilateralize a response with other countries in the hemisphere. So it's not just America, not just the US going down to Haiti, but it's the US working in concert with Brazil, with other countries in the hemisphere to try to provide assistance over time. So I'm worried a little bit about what's happening in Latin America related to America's kind of current set of policies and tools, some of which are hangovers from the Trump years. Never mind, obviously, the Central America issue, where we're trying to deal with migration.
Right. So there are two questions, one from my colleague Emma Ashford and also from Steve Shapiro in the chat, that are related, and I'll try to put them together. Here at the New American Engagement Initiative, we challenge some long-held basic assumptions guiding U.S. foreign policy. And if you were to give some advice, I think this relates to your previous answer, Ben, if you were to give some advice to the to the Biden administration, what truly new approaches to long-running policies like we've seen in Iran or Cuba or elsewhere, what new, original, fresh approaches do you think are most important? And equally important, and I'll add to this, I really was struck by your discussion in the book, and you mentioned it in the talk with Suzanne about the generation of students that you teach, that you were teaching at UCLA. I teach a class at UCDC here in Washington. Same experience. The terrorism is just off the radar screen for younger folks. What are the kinds of policies that might not have sold with a prior generation, but might be particularly attractive to the younger generation, those who are now, coming out of school and starting to get jobs in government and elsewhere?
Well, I think that one thing that I guess the Atlantic Council would uniquely understand is, and I've thought a lot about this, is the structure of the U.S. government. And I was, I said this in the answer to a question of Suzanne, but the structure of the U.S. government determines a lot of what outcomes there are in terms of like where you spend money, who you're hiring, how you're building agencies is very determinative about what you end up spending time on in the world. And what I'm getting at here is climate change. When we, towards the end of the Obama presidency, in the second term, we basically we said, we're gonna try to get a Paris Agreement done. We're gonna try to build this global agreement that provides the infrastructure to fight climate change. To do that, there was no government apparatus to do that. There was no lever to pull. We had a climate envoy in Todd Stern at the State Department who kind of ran his own climate shop. We had some folks in the White House who were experts on this. And then you had some people scattered across the government in the EPA and in other places. And we had to set up kind of an interagency process led by the White House to coordinate all the aspects of the US government necessary to get to a climate agreement, which doesn't just include US commitments. To get to Paris, we needed to make climate change the leading issue, or one of the top 2 or 3 issues in every bilateral relationship in the world. And I think this is something people don't fully appreciate. Suddenly you're talking to China about whether they're building coal plants on Belt Road. You're talking to Brazil about deforestation in the Amazon. You're talking to South Korea about whether they're financing coal around the world. There are issues in every bilateral relationship that will have to be addressed to deal with climate change. Never mind the Europeans, who obviously want us to be doing more. So to me, I think one of the biggest questions that needs to be answered, and that might bring people into government or make young people think that government is more responsive to them, is, are we building a government and a foreign policy apparatus that is prepared to deal with climate change for the next 30, 40 years? That's going to require, I think John Kerry as an envoy is a good step, but it's going to require kind of a vertical staffing in the State Department so that you have climate experts dealing with all these different relationships. It's going to require bringing in, I'm sure Samantha is focused on this, a lot of people into USAID and other agencies who are going to be able to do climate mitigation work, whether that's dealing with population flows, whether that's helping poorer countries transition to clean energy faster. So to me, one of the bigger challenges for the Biden team, that's probably not like making headlines every day, but how are they building a US government that can deal over the next 30 or 40 years with the fact that climate change is going to be increasingly the dominant issue, not just in our domestic policy, but in our foreign policy. So that's one thing I put out there. There are others too. I mentioned Cuba. Obviously, I think they know where I stand on that. But I'd offer the climate one to start. Oh, Chris, you're muted, I think.
I'm not, yeah, there we go. Thank you. One of the first questions that we had from Kelsey Goodspeed had to do with, you talked a lot about multilateralizing our approach to China. And we see some of the challenges here in the sense that our allies have obviously very extensive trading relations with China. And so the question from Kelsey is, what would be some of the repercussions facing Europe from this emerging US-China competition, and the United States trying to influence European, especially NATO partners, to engage less with China or to engage differently? How do you see us managing that? How would you recommend sort of approaching that challenge?
I guess I make one kind of specific, example of this set of trade-offs with Europe, but then I'm kind of a bigger moral point, right? Which you have the freedom to do when you're not having to sit in the situation room and wrestle with trade-offs, right? The first point is that I think, to multilateralize, you have to give something up. Like we can't just be an expectation that Europe's going to sign on to everything that we think with China. I do think, though, that there are ways to structure a conversation with Europe where, if we're looking at China and we're very concerned, obviously, about the direction of events when it comes to the increasing role of the state in the economy, the increasing insistence on kind of full Chinese ownership of anything that's happening in China, it's right for America to think, well, we need certain supply chains to be secure in that capacity, whether that's pharmaceuticals, biotechnology, national security related, hypersonic. We have a semiconductor industry, obviously, that runs through Taiwan. Data privacy and the like. You don't want venture capital money flowing into surveillance or what's happening to the Uyghurs. In the conversation with Europe, Europe has some concerns with the American tech sector that are unrelated necessarily to China. I think we should be listening more to Europe about our tech sector on issues like disinformation and privacy. And it may be that if we're showing that we're willing to kind of meet them somewhere close to halfway on some other concerns that they have, that makes it easier to ask them to do hard things related to tech in China. Because they're sitting there thinking, like, we don't have a tech sector. We've got American tech and Chinese tech. And yes, we have got some European companies, but nothing like what you guys have. If we're going to ask them to decouple, disentangle, whatever word you want, from China, well, then we have to offer something in terms of how the American tech sector is reshaping their countries, right, in ways that aren't always positive. So that would be one solution. The moral point I was going to make is all of us across the board, and I wrestled with this in the book, for 30 years, can anybody honestly say that at any point in the post-Cold War period up to now, that human rights mattered more than profit in our relationship with China? And by the way, when I say us, I don't just mean the US government. I mean, US companies have looked the other way. The US entertainment industry has looked the other way. If we're that concerned about what's happening to the Uyghurs or in Hong Kong, at a certain point, we're gonna have to be willing to make less money in China. And that applies to Europe too. If you can't have it both ways. You can't say, we're really concerned about the kind of political party that would put 1 million people in concentration camps and commit essentially a cultural genocide. But we don't want to lose access to the Chinese market, so there's only so much we'll say about that. I mean, there's a moral trade-off that has to enter into this conversation soon. And it's not just the US government that has to think that through. It's US companies have to think about, yeah, you know what, you'll lose some business if you're not in China. But is it worth it? I'm not sure it is.
Thank you, Ben. So we have a question from Jack Clayton, and I'm going to try to paraphrase it slightly because it's a little long, but I think he raises a really good point about trust and distrust. You talk a lot about it in the book about both the Iraq War and the 2008 financial crisis and how it really eroded confidence in the United States globally, but it also eroded confidence in US elites among the American public. What do you look back on, or what do you think looking forward can be done to sort of repair this disconnect when Americans just they don't have the same knowledge as policymakers, especially when it comes to foreign policy. And yet at the same time, there are expectations throughout the international community. The United States is going to be a global leader. It seems that we have, there's a tension here between communicating with the American people and communicating with the broader public. And in some respects that was revealed. This disconnect between foreign policy elites and the public was there for some time, but was really sort of revealed dramatically over the last 5 or 6 years. How do you deal with that? How do you approach the problem of explaining to the American people or listening to the American people about how the United States should exercise leadership going forward?
Well, I think there's two issues here, right? There's the what do you need to do, and then there's the kind of the separate issue of how do you talk about foreign policy in a way that the Americans listen to. And I think on the what you need to do, I mean, I one of the things I look at in this book is the commonalities between this trend towards authoritarian nationalism in the U.S. and Hungary, across Russia, but obviously we could pick unfortunately any number of countries around the world too. And part of what had happened, I think, not all of it, but part of what had happened is, when the bottom kind of fell out of the momentum of globalization in the crisis in 2008, people lost confidence. People who had already felt their kind of traditional identity, as a Hungarian, as whatever they are, they already felt their traditional identity kind of under some assault from globalization. And then the bottom falls out, and it's like, well, this deal isn't even a good deal anyway. It's rigged. And so what's interesting to me, as someone who lived through it, is an economic crisis created, I think, by kind of greed and unregulated capitalism did not prompt a backlash to the left. It prompted a backlash to the right, because the offering of traditional identity, ethno-nationalism, essentially, blood and soil nationalism, whether in this country or in Hungary or in India and many other places, well, that's the most traditional form of appeal that a political leader can make. And people will write for those appeals in a lot of places, in some cases with good reason. And so to me, from the policy perspective, if we are not dealing more aggressively with kind of the sense of the structural inequality in American and global capitalism, in a sense that this system is not just rigged for a bunch of billionaires, because ironically, that ends up boomeranging back on Democrats more than Republicans for a lot of reasons that we'd have to unpack. So I think, and you see the Biden team trying to do this, but dealing with inequality. And I look at the structural forces in the book, like, to me, it's inequality. It's this kind of post 9/11 hyper securitization of national security, which was a gift, I think, also to a lot of autocrats who expropriated the war on terror for their own purposes, and the extent to which it created a kind of us versus them politics in this country. So I think we need to be dealing with inequality, unwinding, obviously, that kind of post 9/11 focus on our foreign policy, and getting our arms around disinformation and social media. And you guys do great work on this at the Atlantic Council. Those are the kind of structural policy areas that we're way behind. We're way behind on inequality. We're way behind on technology, and we're kind of catching up on terrorism. I think on this separate question of foreign policy, I've had an interesting experience of this. I remember my first boss in Washington, Lee Hamilton, plain-spoken, pragmatic Midwestern guy from Indiana, who was quite good at going to talk to people around the country about foreign policy, because he sounded like them, and I think we and I used to do this myself a lot. We in the foreign policy community often make a mistake where we think what's missing is we just need to go explain to Americans why foreign policy is important to them. They need to understand. We're going to tell you how connected you are to this country, or why international trade is connected to you, or how if we don't deal with this challenge over here, this problem is going to come to America. I mean, that's part of it. But one of the experiences I've had, and we try to do this on my podcast, is like, part of it's just when you talk about foreign policy, talk like a normal person. Like we tend to have these, we're having these acronym-filled discussions, and we assume a lot of knowledge in the audience, and then we think if we could just convince these people that foreign policy matters to them, they care more. I actually think, connecting like Lee Hamilton to Pod Save the World, even though they're very different audiences. Lee's audience was kind of the Midwestern diner set. Our audience is like the 24-year-old who's kind of curious about what's happening in the world, but doesn't know where to go. I think a big part of it is just sounding like a normal person when you talk about these issues. And I'm not saying that from on high. I've made all kinds of mistakes in how I've talked about this. I just think that the number one lesson I've learned from, God save me, 20 years in this area, is the more you sound like a normal person having a conversation with a friend, the more people's ears are going to open up to conversations about foreign policy.
So I have time for one more quick question before I turn it over to Emma. We have a question from Anya Gorodentsev. She's a student at Georgetown. And she asked, what advice would you give to young professionals looking to join the State Department, given America's changing role in the world? What is something you wish you had known before joining government? And unfortunately, it needs to be a short answer, although I could imagine you have lots of things you could say to that.
I mean, the two things I'd say are one, first of all, State Department's great, but there's a lot of places, entry points, right? Into government itself, there's state, there's aid, there's civil service, but there are NGOs, there's an international system. So you have a broad set of options. And second, if you go into government, think about what you want to do more than kind of what you want to be in terms of, do you want to be an expert on climate? Do you want to be an expert on Asia? Do you want to be an expert on something much more specific than what I even just said? And pursue that. If you're kind of pursuing a job somewhere in the distant future, you're actually less likely to get there than if you're just kind of doing what's right in front of you that you're passionate about, that will lead you ultimately to be relied on by people who are important, who will then elevate you.
Great. Thank you very much, Ben. I thought that was great advice to close it out. And I will now turn it over to my colleague, Emma Ashford, a senior fellow here in the New American Engagement.
Hey, yes, thanks, Chris. So I'm Emma Ashford. I'm a senior fellow here at the New American Engagement Initiative. And I just want to thank everybody for what I think was a really great discussion today. And to encourage you all to go out and read Ben's book. It's called After the Fall. And I think it's a great book. Coming at the right time, because, as this discussion showed, it asks some really big questions about US foreign policy today, about America's place in the world, about how we transition from this strange artificial moment after the Cold War to a more normal era of history. How do we learn the lessons of the war on terror as they relate to sort of the US turn towards China rather than just repeat our mistakes? And these are exactly the kind of big questions that we at NAAI also try and answer. So we were very pleased to host Ben here today. So thank you to Ben for taking the time to speak with us. Thanks to Suzanne for your excellent questions, to the event staff here at the Atlantic Council for helping us set this up. And thanks to you all for attending. Hopefully you have a great day.
Thanks, Emma.